Right, DG, I think we should start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this briefing. The South African G20 Sherpa is going to read a statement, after which we'll have an opportunity to take your questions. G20 Sherpa, Mr. Zane Dangor, is accompanied by the Sous Sherpa Ambassador Xolisa Mabongo, as well as South Africa's permanent representative to the United Nations, Ambassador Joyini. As I said, after the statement, we'll do the Q&A. TG, over to you.
Thank you, Clayson, and good morning to all the members of the media. For those of you attending, thank you for honoring this invitation. We also want to thank UN Media for extending these excellent facilities for this briefing. Yesterday, at the invitation of the President of the General Assembly, we briefed the membership of the United Nations on South Africa's G20 Presidency, and we outlined our priorities and also our high-level deliverables for the year. The briefing was an opportunity to bring together the G20 and the broader membership of the UN into the discussions at the level of the G20 on all the critical issues impacting the international community. South Africa prioritizes an inclusive approach to its presidency. This includes engaging the broader membership of the United Nations. We expressed our intention to work with like-minded countries to establish a more equitable, representative, and fit-for-purpose international order. This approach is consistent with our country's foreign policy principles, which includes respect for multilateralism, international law, all of which is underpinned by promoting, protecting, and fulfilling all the human rights of all people without distinction. We believe that a fair, transparent, and inclusive international order is an essential requirement for economic stability and sustained growth. The erosion of multilateralism presents a threat to global growth and stability. We believe that it's in our shared interest that the United Nations is strengthened as we work together to advance the global agenda for people, planet, and prosperity. South Africa's G20 presidency coincides with a multiplicity of interrelated global challenges. We count on the United Nations, its members, and the G20 to work together in the spirit of strong multilateral and international cooperation towards addressing the most pressing challenges of our time and the achievements of our development goals. South Africa's G20 presidency is committed to the implementation of the Pact for the Future. We also seek to raise the ambition for the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, and we also seek to strengthen multilateral cooperation so that we can really have an effective and bold second World Summit for Social Development in 2025. We also want to work towards ensuring that Brazil's hosting of COP30 is successful and ambitious as well. South Africa is of the view that through collective actions of institutions such as the G20 and other multilateral institutions of the world, especially the United Nations, the WTO, and global financial institutions, we can address the shared challenges that we outlined. Our theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability, and our stated priorities and high-level deliverables lie at the core of the original G20 mandate of promoting strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth. So to summarize our 4 main priorities, firstly, we will take action to strengthen disaster resilience and response. Secondly, we will seek to ensure action towards debt sustainability for low-income countries. Third, we will mobilize finance for a just energy transition through increased focus on accelerating the just transition and emphasizing the importance of mobilizing and increasing the quality and quantity of climate finance, particularly for developing economies. And fourth, we seek to harness critical minerals for inclusive growth and sustainable development. The African continent has 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including platinum, gold, diamonds, and coal. It has up to 90% of the world's chromium and platinum. The largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, platinum, and uranium in the world are in Africa. natural capital and critical minerals are important for Africa's socio-economic development. The significance of critical minerals in the context of the global energy transition and efforts to ensure resilient, diversified, and sustainable supply chains has grown. South Africa is working towards a G20 framework on green industrialization and investments to ensure progress towards a grand bargain that promotes value addition to critical minerals close to the source of extraction. Our presidency will also introduce initiatives to foster pressing issues such as inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, reduced inequality, food security, and artificial intelligence governance and innovation. Based on the successes of the past 3 presidencies, which were led by the Global South, which was Indonesia in 2022, India in 2023, and Brazil in 2024, South Africa will sharpen the issues that these 3 developing countries have put on the agenda. This includes championing reform of the multilateral trading system and the international financial architecture, including strengthening the multilateral development banks. We will address the challenge of climate change. We will promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will advocate for gender equality, and we will pursue enhanced international tax cooperation, and we will address illicit financial flows. Lastly, South Africa's G20 presidency will also pursue the following: review of the G20 during its first full cycle, and an elevated compact with Africa, which, as you know, was launched during the G20 presidency of Brazil. South Africa believes that by focusing on these priorities, we will enhance our collective action towards building an inclusive, just, and equal world in which all may prosper, leaving no one and no country behind. Finally, South Africa will convene the second G20 Foreign Ministers meeting on the margins of the General Assembly High-Level Week. This follows Brazil's innovation last year. This engagement also resonates with South Africa's history of inclusive dialogue and common action. Thank you again for sharing your time with us today, and we will now respond to any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, DG. We can take questions now. You know the drill. You identify yourself in your media house, and then we'll get your question.
Thank you, Clayson. On behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, DG Zane Dangor, Ambassador Mbongo, Ambassador Johini, welcome to the press briefing room. I'm Sherwin Bryce-Pease from South African Broadcasting. DG, you talk about threats to multilateralism as threats to global stability. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how some of these threats to multilateralism are manifesting themselves, certainly within the G20, and how South Africa is seeking to navigate these choppy waters.
One at a time. Okay. Thanks. So the threats, I think, are self-evident in many ways. We see attacks on the UN system itself, and many of the attacks on the UN system comes under the color of efficiency and effectiveness. But in essence, it's about weakening the institution's ability to host and allow for the full participation on an equal footing of all member states. We also see more recently on some of the key institutions of global governance linked to the UN that are coming under threat. This includes the institutions that were established to hold all countries without exception accountable for breaches of international law. We see sanctions on the International Criminal Court. We see criticisms of the International Court of Justice. These are all attacks on the multilateral system. But it's not just an attack on these institutions, and we must bear that in mind. An attack on the UN is not just an attack on the institution and the Secretariat. It's really also an attack on the sovereignty of all member states. Similarly, if you attack a treaty-based institution such as the ICC, it's not an attack on the prosecutors. It's essentially also an attack on member states who are willingly signed and ratified these treaties. So these are just some of the manners in which the international system is under threat. And we believe that, for countries that don't have huge military powers or large economies to use in order to shape the world, we depend on the institutions of global governance so that we can use these platforms to hold all of us accountable, but also to make our voices heard. And that's what we seek to protect. And that's what we're working with others, whether it's in the European Union, the African Union, but also the broader membership of the UN to protect. We've always taken the view that the UN needs to be reformed. It's, some of the institutions such as the Security Council needs to be reformed. The ECOSOC needs to be revitalized. But reform does not mean destroy. And I think that's an important issue to underscore.
Let's start here and then we'll go there.
BBC News. Just wondering if you think it's time for South Africa to have a different approach to the attacks that are coming from the Trump administration. Just yesterday, Secretary Rubio talked about politicians in South Africa needing to protect Afrikaners and talked of continued horrible threats to them, threats of violence. Your ambassador was expelled. The attacks have come from the president himself. How long are you going to take all this, hoping that the storm will just pass?
I think we need to break the attacks down. So what is it that there may be unhappiness with South Africa about? So let's take the issue about Afrikaners in our society and race-based laws. And if you do an assessment of all of that, there are no race-based laws. And in fact, many of the race-based laws that they cite no longer exist. They're from the apartheid era. What they do cite is a set of pieces of legislation and policies that seek to foster inclusion, such as affirmative action, issues around redress, land reform. So what we're finding is a combination of a deliberate misinformation campaign by people who are losing privilege. And equality itself is the threat. So how do we undo that? We have to explain what our policies are about. You can't undo redress policies after a significant number of years of systemic exclusion from the economy, from ownership of land, of the vast majority of South Africans. And that structure has not changed. And therefore these redress policies remain important. So we cannot be changing our policies and principles which arise from our constitution based on these attacks. What we can do is engage with the US about what the truth is, what's misinformation, what's fact and what's fiction. Similarly, I think there's also been an attack on our approach to the ICJ. And there we're saying, we're acting in terms of our obligations under the Genocide Convention. If you read Article 1 and Article 2 of the Convention, it basically states that all members, all states who have ratified the Convention have a duty to prevent or punish acts of genocide. And that the ICJ is the appropriate forum to do that. And that's the route we've taken. We're saying that if you have a different set of facts, if you believe that this is not genocide, the court is the space to deal with that. Put in place papers where you put a different set of facts on the table. Let the court decide based on competing facts about what is at play. And so again, we will explain that. The dangers of forcing South Africa to do something differently means that small countries, middle-income countries, will never be able to use these institutions and will remain what is called the international legal subalterns forever. And we believe that these institutions were designed for all, not just for a few. And all countries must be held accountable without exception. Exceptionalism creates impunity, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So we will engage with the US administration, and I think that we will have to work through what is the misinformation, where does the misinformation come from, and put a different set of facts for them to consider on the table.
Yeah, Benny Avnio, New York Sun. Two questions. One, yesterday there was a story in one of the big newspapers in town about ICE, which is the people who are in charge of protecting America's border, lurking around the UN headquarters, seeking to maybe deport some people at the UN. Do you think the UN headquarters in New York City is still viable, or do you see in the Trump administration adversarial approach to that proposition? And secondly, on the ICJ, I think the argument that that members of administrations are making is that you brought the case of genocide against Israel, but not in other places where one can argue similar events are happening, Uyghurs in China, Sudan, whatever.
On the threats to UN staffers at the UN, I don't have a comment on that. I don't think that it's at this, we haven't seen any evidence at this stage of harassment. But our colleagues here in New York, is there anything specific on this that you want to talk about? Yeah.
There hasn't been. We haven't seen anything as yet.
Yeah, but do you think that there's any threat to the UN headquarters being placed in United States? Would you like to see it move somewhere else?
I don't think South Africa would like to support any movement of the UN headquarters from New York at this stage. I think there's a hosting agreement in place. It's been hosted by the US since its inception, and there's no reason for it to be moving. I think that the resilience of the US democracy and the institutional capacity to host this is one that we all respect, and there's no reason for it to move. On the ICJ issue, genocide and the convention and the jurisprudence of genocide is very clear on what constitutes genocide and issues of intent, and we had to make an assessment based on our obligations. What we saw when we took action based on that. We may not have taken other issues up, but clearly we would have taken it up if we felt that there was a clear case of genocide. And we support other cases that are in front of the court at the moment, and we work with many other countries on this. But this idea that you didn't do it for others means that you shouldn't do it for one of the most visible genocide unfolding this century. Talks about the dereliction of the rule of law in a domestic space, for example. If you take the rule of law at a domestic level, one could then argue that we see a mass murderer, and there's enough evidence to charge that mass murderer. But because the Justice Department didn't do it for others, that they should turn a blind eye on this particular one. I think we should be judged on, are we doing this for the right reasons? Is there ample evidence to back up what we're saying? And if you look at the findings on jurisdiction by the court, where they said there is a plausible case for us to pursue, that's what we should be judged on. The Genocide Convention and the ICJ in particular deals on disputes between states. And that's what it's a dispute between ourselves and Israel about whether it's genocide or not. It's an Article 9 application. Some of the criticisms is that we did not include Hamas in the case. We cannot include them in the genocide case, which is why we basically called for the ICC to investigate them. Our application to the ICC includes Hamas and the State of Israel. And that's why the warrants of arrest that came out included both.
Yeah, it includes two people who are dead.
Before I go to the virtual platform, Sherwin, and then we'll go to the colleagues on the virtual platform.
Just to follow up, right? So, essentially a lot of conversation about the relationship between the United States and South Africa. How is that playing itself out currently within the G20? We know Marco Rubio didn't attend the foreign ministers meeting. The Secretary of the Treasury didn't attend the finance ministers meeting. You're talking about another FM meeting in September. What's the level of U.S. engagement? I know you have a Sherpa meeting in D.C. this week. How is the United States contributing? They didn't speak in your meeting yesterday, one of the only P5 members to not attend. What does that tell us about where we're going in terms of the G20 here?
So let me start with the last part, Joe. And I think the meeting was well attended, significant attendance and significant support coming for South Africa's priorities. And I just see the colleagues saying that they were there. So, yeah. So they... Okay. But look, the US did participate. When we took over in December 2024, still under the previous administration, they participated in the Sherpa meeting, fully supported our priorities. After the change in administration, we also saw participation at the foreign ministers meeting, although be it at not the level of a foreign minister, but again, the US participation, they accepted South Africa's priorities and also accepted the chair's summary. There was a bit of a difference when it came to the finance ministers meeting. So we have seen participation, and we're seeing the challenges coming in some of the meetings. We also see them participating in working group meetings where they're making their views heard. We will be meeting this week as a troika with Brazil and the US. We will be looking at, as the troika normally does, how do we implement the priorities of the current presidency. The US will be the president next year, and Brazil was the past president. And we'll be working with the US to work out what the modalities are to ensure that we have a successful outcome, bearing in mind that they may have some real concerns about our themes and our priorities as the president. But we'll definitely work that out with them.
Right, so I want to go to the virtual platform. Any questions there?
I have a question online. Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
My question, would South Africa continue to pay the price for taking the issue of the genocide in Gaza to the ICJ? And do you think that what happened in Washington is motivated by that move? Thank you.
So the approach to the ICJ was in the interest of justice. It was in the interest of, it's in line with our respect for rule of law, both at the domestic and international level. And we understand that there may be some countries who disagree with the approach that we've taken. And as I said before, if you disagree, if you think that in terms of the Genocide Convention, and if you're looking at the jurisprudence of genocide, and you believe that what is unfolding in Gaza is not genocide, the approach that should be taken is we filed a memorial. In our memorial, we put in place what we believe is the evidence that the genocidal actions is accompanied by intent, which is the key defining issue. Special intent must be present. If you believe that special intent is not present and therefore it's not genocide, put facts on the table, use the court. Bring a legal team who will put a counter memorial. Israel will put a counter memorial in that will support their submissions, and let the court decide. We don't think it's in the interest of justice, global justice, for South Africa to withdraw under pressure, because that will signal all the wrong moves in terms of ensuring that all countries are held accountable equally under the institutions set up to hold us accountable.
I see we still have a bit of time. Is there follow-up from the virtual platform? In the room? I'm echoing. That's nice. All right, thank you very much. That concludes our briefing today. Thank you for coming through. Enjoy the rest of the day, Sherwin.